What's up guys, and welcome to my release Ashveil guide. In this video I'm taking you over everything you do need to know, including a kit overview on Ashveil, best Lightcones, best relic sets and planar ornaments, the main stat and substat goals, and finally some team building ideas. Ashveil's basic attack deals lightning damage based off his attack to a designated enemy. His skill will mark an enemy that you attack as bait, doing lightning damage based off his attack to them. If you attack someone that is already bait, it additionally will deal more lightning damage based off his attack to that enemy and will also recover a skill point. Bait existing on the field will reduce all enemies' defense by 40%, and if there's no bait on the field, Ashveil will make the enemy with the lowest HP on the field become bait. His ultimate will make whoever you decide to attack as bait and then do lightning damage based off his attack to that enemy, and will immediately launch his talent's enhanced follow-up attack against that bait and also grant Ashveil 3 charges. The enhanced follow-up attack does not consume charge, and having 4 gluttony stacks will consume those 4 stacks to deal an additional instance of lightning damage based off his attack, and if that instance of follow-up attack deals a killing blow to a target, it will continue to do damage to the new bait, and will also trigger until gluttony becomes lower than 4 stacks. If all enemies on the field have been defeated, the follow-up attack will end. His talent grants Ashveil an initial charge of 2, holding up to a maximum of 3. If an ally hits bait, Ashveil will regenerate 8 energy and consume a charge to launch a follow-up attack against that bait that does lightning damage based off his attack, and afterwards will gain 2 stacks of gluttony, which stack up to 12. Ashveil's technique will inflict daze on enemies you do hit, and entering combat via attacking an enemy that is inflicted with Ashveil's talent will deal lightning damage based off his attack to all enemies and grant Ashveil 1 charge. For his bonus traces, Ashveil can gain 1/2 gluttony stacks when using skill/ultimate respectively, and if Ashveil's follow-up attack deals a killing blow to an enemy, he will gain a stack of gluttony. His A4 increases Ashveil's follow-up attack damage by 80%, and every stack of gluttony currently in possession will further increase the damage dealt by the follow-up attack by 10%, and his A6 will increase the crit damage dealt by ally targets by 40%, and crit damage dealt by ally targets follow-up attacks by an additional 80%. Finally, for his Eidolons, his E1 will make all enemies take 24% increased damage while Ashveil is on the field, and if an enemy's HP percentage falls below 50%, the damage they receive increases to 36%. His E2 increases his gluttony stack limit to 18, and anytime he uses enhanced follow-up attack, 35% of removed gluttony will be refunded. His E4 increases his attack by 40% for 3 turns when using ultimate, and his E6 will reduce all enemies all-type res by 20% when having bait on the field, and will also increase Ashveil's damage up by 4% for every stack of gluttony gained in the current battle. That stacks up to 30 times, so you are able to get up to a 120% damage dealt increase overall. For Ashveil's best Lightcones, his best one overall for his role is going to be his own signature Lightcone, providing the wearer 18% crit rate, up to 40% attack, and also increasing the damage taken by enemies by 20% when the wearer does have Umbra Devourer, which the requirement is just entering battle or 4 instances of follow-up attacks, which is very easy, so it really just is permanent uptime. As Ashveil's role can be a hyper carry or sub DPS in the future, mainly emphasizing his sub DPS, this Lightcone still provides him crit rate to make him easier to build since he has no crit rate in his actual kit, while also getting 40% attack, which he is deprived of. To top it all off, for his sub DPS role, he makes enemies take 20% increased damage, which is not only good for himself but also his team. So you can very much run this Lightcone whether he is a sub DPS, so for his sub DPS role this is going to be the best in slot usually always, and for his main DPS it practically always can be the best. But there's only one other one that really contests it in the main DPS category where the other one can actually outperform. Otherwise, this would be his best, and the one that is just as good if not better for his main DPS potential is Ratio's signature Lightcone, providing 20% crit damage for the wearer and an additional 8% crit damage dealt to enemies with 3 debuffs, so every debuff is 8% that stacks up to 3 times. When the wearer uses ultimate, they gain Disputation, which will increase damage dealt by 36%, and follow-up attacks gain a 24% defense ignore for 2 turns. The only downside about this Lightcone is it further emphasizes on crit damage, which Ashveil doesn't necessarily have problems with, and doesn't really provide any crit rates, so building him can actually be a lot harder. However, if you're able to get past that, then of course more crit damage is just more damage, also provides some damage dealt, and mainly 24% defense ignore for follow-up attacks, which pairs perfectly with his 40% defense shred. So with this active and also his defense shred active, that's 64% value, and the more you get, the more it gets impactful, so it helps you get closer to 100% values, which makes this Lightcone very good and usually the best for his hyper carry options. Topaz's signature is also really good, providing 18% crit rate and 30% increase to follow-up attack damage. And the way using a follow-up attack on the enemy will inflict them with the tame state, which will make enemies take 12% more crit damage, which stacks up to 2 times. So also good for his main DPS / sub DPS, crit rate same amount as his signature, while also increasing follow-up attack damage, which is his main source of damage, and also making enemies take even more crit damage. So anyone on your team can deal more crit damage to them anytime they are critting. So it's not super far off his signature Lightcone, but it's still not better. But if you have this via just having it from the past, or if you have it from the shop since you are able to buy it, it is a fantastic alternative option. One of his best options that is a little restrictive and forces you to run him with Sparkle is Archer's Lightcone, providing 16% crit rate when entering battle. If you have 6 skill point limit or higher, the wearer gets 40% attack, and after each instance of skill will increase attack by 10% up to 4 times. So 2% less crit rate than his signature or Topaz's Lightcone, which is not too far off. But as you see, the requirement is to have over 6 point skill limit, and you would need Sparkle to do that. While Sparkle is one of his best teammates, not all his teams will use Sparkle, so this Lightcone would force you to always use Sparkle with him. So definitely keep that in mind. But with the requirement, 40% attack is very, very good, and also an additional 10% for every time you use skill. So using skill every time for 4 times will give you an additional 10%. So you can get up to 80% attack, which is very good for his potential, and his main DPS potential as well. So this is also a very, very good option to use. The Herder Shop Lightcone is also good, providing 8% crit rate and an additional 8% when hitting someone 50% or less HP, and defeating an enemy increases attack by 20% for 2 turns, and at S5, both crit rate values are 16% with 40% attack. 16% also 2 below the actual signature, but you can get an additional 16% when attacking someone with lower than 50% HP, but you don't want to fully base your build around this because for the first half of that enemy's HP, you will not be getting the additional effect, but it's good to cover mainly like 5 to 10% missing crit rate when you do count it for your build, and defeating an enemy is a big part of Ashveil's playstyle, so 40% attack on that is going to be very good. So if this is available for you to use, this is also a fantastic free-to-play option. For 4-star options, you can use the Battle Pass Lightcone CU at the end, which provides crit damage to the wearer, and skill damage and follow-up attack damage dealt will also be increased, and at S5, both values become 40%. Unfortunately, it doesn't provide any crit rates, so again, it's going to be harder to build him, but if you are able to get past that, more crit damage and also more damage dealt to his skill, which does do damage, and his follow-up attack, which is his main source of damage, which is simple yet very effective. So if you do have this Lightcone laying around and you can focus on S5ing it, it is very good. For Ashveil's best relic set, his best slot is the 4-piece Ashblazing Grand Duke set, with the 2-piece increasing his main source of damage being follow-up attack damage, and the 4-piece is able to increase attack based on the amount of times a follow-up attack deals damage. Ashveil does have over 8 hits in his follow-up attack, meaning he can fully stack this up every time he launches it. And as Ashveil is quite attack deprived in his base kit, the 4-piece providing you that attack increase is very beneficial. So anytime he launches follow-up attack, he's able to just fully stack it and actually have a bit of hits after it's fully stacked to land as well, so fully buff follow-up attack at the very end. And when he launches his enhanced follow-up attack, the regular one fully stacks it, so once the enhanced hits go off, all of them are going to have the attack buff. So you are going to see a big damage increase with the set, which overall makes it his best in slot 4-piece. You can also use 4-piece Pioneer with the 2-piece increasing damage dealt to enemies with debuffs, 4-piece increasing crit rate and increasing crit damage dealt to enemies with more debuffs, and if the wearer inflicts a debuff on the enemy target, aforementioned effects will increase by 100%. So with bait on the field, everyone has 40% defense shred, so the 2-piece will always be active, and the 4-piece is actually able to provide you a lot of crit damage and a good amount of crit rate. Once you do get the aforementioned effects increase, the crit rate goes to 8%, and you are able to get a lot of crit damage dealt. However, this can be more annoying or easy depending on how many debuffs you do have on the enemy and your investment with Lightcone on Ashveil. He has his own debuffs, but you may need to run someone else that might have 1 or 2 other debuffs to actually consistently have this up, which isn't really a problem since a lot of his teammates do have a form of a debuff, such as Chibi, who has vulnerability in her zone, Sparkle, who also is able to inflict vulnerability. If you run him along Cypher, she has a bunch of debuffs as well, and then Lightcones you might have on said other characters depends as well. There's a good amount of sources, so usually on his teams you wouldn't necessarily have a problem with this, but do make sure they have enough debuffs to get the full effect, and if it is fully active, it is also a solid option to use. However, still worse than Ashblazing Grand Duke set. This set is situational depending on your investment, but 4-piece Genius does actually work. 2-piece is useless, 4-piece provides 10% defense ignore, and an additional 10% if attacking a quantum weak enemy. So the reason this is really good depending on your situation is because Ashveil already inflicts a massive 40% shred, and depending on the investment of your team and other characters on the team, if they have other sources to give Ashveil ignore, such as Sunday E1, or if they have defense shred in their idol equivalents such as Sparkle E2, and you're actually able to get up to like 80%-ish defense ignore without any other help of a relic set, so not including this. And this set actually pushes you up to the 90% or especially the 100% for full value. This set actually becomes very competitive with the Ash Blazing set. Again, that really depends on your investment. If you're running just him and only his 40% defense shred is the source of any defense shred / ignore, and this just pushes you up to 50% or 60% of their quantum weak, it's going to be significantly weaker than the other options and would not be worth it. It's only worth it if this set helps you be pushed into the 90% defense shred / ignore or especially hit 100%. So it's very team dependent, but if you are able to get that value, the 4-piece genius set is actually very strong. Past that, you would just run 2-piece, so you can run 2-piece attack percent increasing sets, so 2-piece hero, 2-piece wind soaring, 2-piece dot, or 2-piece musketeers. Combine that with another attack percent increasing set, so any of the ones there, or you can do 2-piece ash blazing set as well for the follow-up attack increase. 2-piece pioneer also does work with damage against debuffed enemies. You can also combine one of the crit sets, so if you need crit rate, you can do scholar or world or making deliver 2 pieces. If you need crit damage, you can do wave strider or everglorious magical girl set, and if you want lightning bonus, you can do 2-piece of the band set. Really, just do any combination of them. They're all very marginal between each other. It doesn't really matter what you choose. So if you're doing a 2-piece, just pick whichever one has the best actual overall stats. For planar ornaments, this does depend on what you want to focus on more. If you want to focus on his own damage potential more, Durin is going to be his best in slot, providing a 5% increase to follow-up damage every time someone on the team, including Ashveil, uses a follow-up attack, and reaching 5 stacks will also increase the wearer's crit damage by 25%. So 25% increase to follow-up damage and also 25% increase to crit damage. So 25% increase to both, 25% crit damage is going to be for all sources of damage when he crits, and then the additional 25% follow-up attack is his main source of damage. If you want to get the best output on Ashveil's damage, this would be the one. If you want to lean more into the sub DPS, then you can run the new city set, which increases the wearer's attack by 24% when they launch as a follow-up attack, and an enemy target getting defeated will increase the crit damage of all allies by 12% in the current battle and cannot stack. So 24% increase to attack and also 12% crit damage for the entire team. So it focuses a bit less on his own damage, so it's not as good of a buff for his own personal damage, but it's also giving everyone 12% crit damage, so they can do slightly more damage. So if you want to lean more on the sub DPS side, you can very much run this instead. When paired with another hunt character, you can use Izumo, providing 12% attack and 12% crit rate, with the requirement being another character that is the same path as the wearer to get the crit rate. So in this case, you would have to pair him with someone else that is hunt, be it with Moze on a hyper carry team, or if he is a sub DPS on a phase shao team, or you're running him alongside ratio. You just need to have another hunt character, which can be a bit difficult depending on what you're doing, but if you do have that requirement, Izumo can be very good since it helps with his attack to prize stat and also crit rate, which he doesn't get much of. Salsalo also works good, providing 8% crit rate and 15% increase to the wearer's ultimate and follow-up attack damage, with the only requirement being 50% or higher crit rate, which is not a problem. So making him easier to build with 8% crit rate and also an increase to his main source of damage follow-up attack, while also impacting his ultimate a little bit. Worse than the other options, but still very much fine if you do have pieces laying around, or at least while you do farm the other pieces. If paired specifically with Danheng as a hyper carry, so you're running him as a hyper carry and then Danheng as a sustain, making him the bond mate, you can use Ben and Amusement, providing 16% crit damage and an additional 32% crit damage when a target is summoned by the wearer is on the field. He doesn't actually innately have a summon, so with bond mate and Danheng's dragon, you can attach it to him to make it considered to get the full increase of 48% crit damage. This is again only if you are running Ashveil hyper carry and running him with a Danheng sustain, which is very common. So if you are doing that, you can very much use this. For the main stats on the relics, for the body, primarily everyone is going to run crit rate in order to maintain a healthy crit ratio, but if you have a crit rate Lightcone and you are running something like crit rate supports, alongside having good crit rate rolls where you can actually run a different body piece, then in that case you can run crit damage or attack percent. For the feat, you would run attack percent or speed depending on your build. If you're running him alongside Sparkle and or RMC, you will run attack percent as you want to have a base speed build. If you're running him with Sunday or Bronya for a -1 setup, you want to run speed, and if you're running him as a sub DPS, you also will want to run speed. For the orb, you can do lightning damage or attack percent with a -1 setup alongside a character like Sunday who does have a bunch of damage dealt buffs. In that case, you primarily will be running attack percent, but if you're pairing him alongside characters that allow him to be built with base speed and attack percent boots, and maybe you're even running an attack percent body, you might already have a good amount of attack percent to allow you to run a lightning orb. For the late group, you want to run attack percent. For the subsets, if you are doing a -1 setup, of course the first priority is is going to be speed. Get it to 1-ish speed above your action advancer. So if your Bronya or Sunday is at 138 speed, then you would need to get Ashveil to around 139 speed, and that's not assuming for any E2 Bronya setup. However, if you are running him at base speed alongside RMC and or Sparkle, then completely ignore the speed step. For sub DPS speed goals, really all you need is 134, and then the more you can get past that is good. But you don't want to fully focus on it as his damage stats are important. Past that, for anyone else, or if you already have your speed goal achieved, you just focus on crit rate, crit damage, and attack percent. Crit rate is very important to get to 100% as Ashveil has a lot of attacks in his follow-up attack, and you want to make sure all his enhanced hits especially are critting, so 100% crit rate is ideal. If you're running him alongside Sunday, all you need is 20% less, since Sunday does give 20%, so you would just need 80% and Sunday would bring you to 100%. If you're running him alongside Sparkle Lightcone, then you would need 90%. Same thing applies to RMC as they also have a 10% crit rate buff. And if you're running him alongside a team with RMC and a Sparkle Lightcone somewhere on the team, then you would only need 80% as you have two sources of 10% crit rate. So you just want to ensure you have as close to 100% as possible, especially after the crit rate buffs. And if there's no crit rate buffs, if you're running him as a sub DPS, then aim for around 90% to 95% minimum. And again, ideally 100%. Attack percent and crit damage, you just want to get it to as high as you can. Ideally on any team setups, having around 3200 is going to be ideal, since there's a bunch of different setups you can do to have attack percent, like the body, if you're doing base speed, if you're running an attack orb. Just a general rule to have around at least 3100 minimum, but 3200 ideally or higher is good. Crit damage is the same priority as attack, but you don't have to focus on it an insane amount just because he does have a lot of crit damage access through his supports, and even in his base kit where his follow-up attack can get a lot of crit damage, plus he has crit damage traces, so getting his crit damage around 140% would be fine. Now finally for team building, this of course changes depending on if you're running him as a main or sub DPS. Covering the main DPS part first, the second slot usually goes to an action advancer. The overall best one you can use with him is going to be RMC since they are actually able to attack, but you can very much use Sparkle or Sunday. Either or is fine. With Sparkle or RMC or both, you want to run hyper speed supporters with a base speed Ashveil, and then with Sunday or actually even Bronya is also fine. You can use Bronya in that slot as well, but Sunday is better. You would be running a -1 setup. So in my case, I'll just use Sunday for an example of a -1. The third slot usually goes to someone like Tribi, and then the last slot goes to Danang on this team. So this would be a standard hyper carry setup. And then of course you can sub out. You mainly just want to have characters that can attack, so you can 1 actually proc his charges for the follow-up attack, and 2 funnel him energy. You can very much use someone like Aventurian instead, since Aventurian does have good follow-up attack output and just attacks. But running a very fast healer like Luocha works, you know, you can use Popo since she does provide attack and energy. You just need to build them fast enough so that where they can actually attack a good amount. Instead of Tribi, you can also use Cypher since Cypher does have good attack frequency and also good debuffs. The team wouldn't really change much if you're using RMC or Sparkle in this spot. It's kind of the same. So if instead I were to put Sparkle, the team would still look something like this. If you were to use RMC in this spot instead, then of course you would do that. If you're running a Sparkle plus RMC setup, then of course the third slot would be RMC or Sparkle respectively. So the team would look like this. Go ahead, put that there. Boom. And then if you are doing sustainless, of course you can sub out the actual slot here for usually someone like Cypher or Tribi, as those two would be great here. So it does vastly depend on your options there, but that's kind of how you'd go about building him for a main carry. If you are using him as a sub DPS with Face Out, of course the DPSs would be these two together. The third slot now especially wants to go to Tribi since Tribi just has good AM for both of them. Unfortunately with Robin, you have less attack frequency to funnel more energy to Ashveil, and Ashveil is a big focus on this team. Last slot goes to sustain. You can either use Danhang or Aventurian, so the team would look like this. If you are doing sustainless, then in that slot, you still can use Robin to make Feisha do a lot more damage, since without Robin, Feisha loses a lot of damage, but Ashveil kind of functions as a replacement. Or here, you can also just put Cypher instead, as she was on the previous team, just someone to help both of them do more damage and or provide more output. And if you're using Ratio, really the same thing applies. You just take out Feisha and go ahead and put out Ratio instead, so the team would be the same. For a more unrelated to follow-up team, like an Archer team, then you could use Ashveil Archer, and then Sparkle, of course, to buff Archer, and last slot would either go to a sustain like Danhang or whatever option you do have. And if you're doing sustainless, which with Ashveil you probably would be doing a sustainless setup since the team have other options, so you would usually put Sparkle there. So you would usually put someone like Cypher there, and you can also just use Silverwolf instead of Cypher there as well, since Silverwolf also does work good with Archer, or Sarija, whatever option you do have available there. So that's kind of how you'd go about using him as a sub DPS. And that is the full Ashveil guide. I do hope you found this video helpful. If you did, dropping a like would be greatly appreciated. If you're new to the channel or haven't done so already, be sure to subscribe and turn on the bell for future videos like this, along with all the types of star content, and I'll see you later. Peace out.